Imagine a place where the cries of the forgotten never stop, where the sick and the suffering are shackled to walls, left to rot in their own filth. A place so infamous that its very name became a synonym for madness. This was Bedlam, the most notorious asylum in history. For centuries, it stood in the heart of London, a towering reminder of how little society understood mental illness. But what truly happened inside its walls? How did a place meant for healing become a spectacle of horror? And who were the unfortunate souls locked away, lost to history? Long before the word psychiatry existed, mental illness was not understood. It was feared. It was seen as a punishment from God, a sign of possession, or a moral failing. There was no medical treatment and no real understanding, only superstition and cruelty. Bedlam began in 1247, not as an asylum, but as a simple monastic hospital founded by the Bishop of Bethlehem. At first, it was a place of charity, offering care to the sick and the poor. But as time passed, something changed. The hospital transformed, its halls filling with the restless, the disturbed, and the abandoned. Overcrowding, neglect, and a lack of medical knowledge turned it into a place of horror rather than healing. Those who entered Bedlam rarely left. Patients were locked in dark, filthy cells, subjected to bizarre and brutal treatments. Some were chained to walls for years. Others were forced to endure cures that bordered on torture. The most shocking part: people paid money to watch. Wealthy visitors flocked to Bedlam to gawk at the suffering, treating it as entertainment. But to truly understand the horror of Bedlam, we have to go back to its origins, its rise, and the real stories of those who lived and died within its walls. At first, Bedlam was just another building in London, a small institution tucked away from the bustling streets. But by the late 14th century, it had already begun to shift from a place of care to something far more ominous. The city was growing, and with it came more people deemed unmanageable. Not criminals, but the sick, but those whose minds worked differently. There were no real hospitals for such people. There was nowhere else to send them. Society had no understanding of mental illness, only fear. Without medicine or psychology, the treatment was left to trial and error. Some were forced to drink potions made of herbs, vinegar, or even mercury. Others were beaten or left in total isolation in hopes of driving out whatever force had taken hold of them. In reality, no one knew what to do. By the early 1400s, the conditions inside Bedlam were worsening. Overcrowding had begun, and the hospital's caretakers struggled to manage the growing number of inmates. The line between patient and prisoner blurred. Some were violent, others were catatonic, but all were lumped together. There were no diagnoses, no records, only chaos behind locked doors. And yet, despite the suffering within, Bedlam's reputation spread beyond its walls. Londoners began to whisper about what lay inside, what kind of people were locked away there, what horrors took place. Soon, those outside its walls wouldn't just be talking about Bedlam, they would be paying to see it for themselves. By the 17th century, Bedlam was no longer just a place for housing the mentally ill. It had become a spectacle. Londoners were no longer content to merely whisper about what went on behind its walls. They wanted to see it for themselves. And so, the doors of Bedlam were opened, not for the patients, but for the public. Anyone with a few coins could walk through the asylum's halls, gawking at the suffering inside. Patients were treated as nothing more than entertainment. Visitors would laugh, jeer, and prod at those too weak or broken to fight back. The worst off were chained to the walls, half naked and starving, their bodies washed away by neglect. Those who still had the energy to scream were met with worse punishments: beatings, forced dunkings in ice-cold water, and devices designed to correct madness through pain. These tortures were not hidden, they were part of the attraction. Medical treatment, if it could be called that, was crude and often deadly. The belief at the time was that madness stemmed from an imbalance in the body. To restore order, doctors relied on methods like bloodletting, purging, and forced vomiting. Patients were strapped into chairs that spun violently to shake the madness from their brains, Some were subjected to scalding hot or freezing cold baths, held under until their thrashing stopped. If they survived, they were deemed calmer and improved. If not, they were simply replaced by the next unfortunate soul. Not everyone in Bedlam was insane. Some had been sent there by families who saw them as an embarrassment. Others were poor, abandoned, with no way to escape. One of the most infamous cases was that of James Norris, an American Marine who spent 10 years chained to a wall, his body wasting away until he could no longer stand. By the time reformers finally saw what had been done to him, it was too late. Bedlam had transformed into something monstrous, a place where suffering was sport, where healing was torture, and where those trapped inside were no longer seen as people at all. And as his reputation spread, so did his infamy, cementing his place as one of the most feared institutions in history. For centuries, the horrors of Bedlam were ignored. It was a fixture of London, an institution so deeply woven into the city's fabric that few questioned what went on inside. But by the early 19th century, the world was beginning to change. Medicine was advancing, public attitudes towards mental illness were shifting, and the cruelty of Bedlam was becoming impossible to hide. The first cracks in its foundation were forming. The turning point came in 1814, when a group of outside observers were finally allowed inside. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Starving patients, many barely clothed, lay in filth. Some were chained to the walls, their limbs twisted from years of immobility. Others, driven mad by isolation, rocked back and forth, muttering to themselves in darkened corners. The stench alone was unbearable. Public outcry was swift, investigations were launched, and pressure mounted on the government to act. In 1815, Bedlam was relocated to a new facility in South London, designed to be more humane. Chains were removed, physical punishment was reduced, and some patients were even given structured activities. But these changes were superficial. Beneath the surface, the suffering continued. The asylum still lacked true medical care, and patients remained little more than prisoners. The real shift came from reformers like William Tuke and Philip Pinnell, who championed the idea of moral treatment. They argued that mental illness was not a curse or a crime, but a condition that required care, not punishment. Their ideas began to take hold, influencing asylums across Europe. Gradually, the most barbaric practices were abandoned, but Bedlam's reputation never recovered. By the 20th century, the institution had faded into obscurity. Modern psychiatric hospitals replaced asylums, and Bedlam, once the most feared name in mental health, was no longer the centre of attention. But the damage had already been done. The suffering of thousands had left a permanent scar on history, and though the asylum was gone, its legacy would never be forgotten. Bedlam may have closed its doors as an asylum, but its legacy never truly faded. The very name became a permanent part of the English language, synonymous with chaos and madness. For centuries it stood as a symbol of everything that was wrong with how the world treated the mentally ill. An institution built not on care, but on control, confinement and cruelty. Even as psychiatry evolved and treatments improved, the shadow of Bedlam loomed over the history of mental health care. The building itself went through many transformations. After its relocation in the 19th century, the original site was demolished, but the name lived on. The new facility, now known as the Bethlem Royal Hospital, still functions today, not as a place of torment, but as a modern psychiatric institution. Yet even as it embraced reform, the past could not be erased. Stories of what once happened behind those walls became the stuff of legend, inspiring books, films, and gothic horror tales. The very idea of the madhouse in popular culture owes much to the grim reality of Bedlam's history. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Bedlam is the fate of those who suffered there. Thousands passed through its gates, yet most of their names are lost to time. They were locked away, forgotten by society, and when they died, many were buried in unmarked graves. Their suffering may have ended, but their voices remain unheard. Though Bedlam is gone, its echoes remain, a stark reminder of a time when mental illness was met with fear instead of understanding, when treatment was indistinguishable from punishment, and when the world turned suffering into a spectacle. The walls of Bedlam may have crumbled, but the suffering it housed still echoes through history, a chilling reminder of what happens when humanity turns its back on those who need it most.